November 1983. Somewhere over the Barents Sea. The world is a gradient of endless blue and blinding white. At 40,000 feet, the sky is a thin, dark indigo. Below, a fractured plain of Arctic ice stretches to the curve of the Earth. The silence here is absolute. A vacuum sealed by 5 miles of atmosphere. It is broken only by the low, constant thunder of 8 Pratt & Whitney turbojet engines. Inside the cockpit of the Boeing B-52G Stratofortress, the air is stale, recycled. The crew moves with a ritualized, tired precision. Radar screens paint green ghosts of distant weather systems. Navigators plot silent courses over a featureless void. This is a routine orbit, a leg of a mission measured not in hours but in days. The bomber, codenamed Maverick 21, is heavy. Not with bombs, but with a full load of AGM-86B air-launched cruise missiles, each one a nuclear-tipped spear capable of finding its own way to a target deep inside the Soviet Union. 200 miles to the east, inside the pressurized dome of a Soviet Oko early warning radar station on the Kola Peninsula, a young conscript's eyes glaze over the phosphorescent glow of his scope. He sees the usual clutter: ice flow returns, atmospheric anomalies. A faint, intermittent blip appears at the extreme edge of his detection range. He marks it as a possible commercial airliner, Transpolar Flight Path 451. He files the contact. It is unremarkable. He has no idea he is looking at Maverick 21. He does not know that this single aircraft is part of a relentless 24-hour-a-day ballet of deterrence. He cannot see the other B-52s at this exact moment, flying similar patrols off the coast of Kamchatka, circling the barren outskirts of the Black Sea, threading the narrow corridors of the Gyuk Gap. While his comrades in the 40th Army fight a vicious ground war in the mountains of Afghanistan, a different invisible war is being waged in the stratosphere above his homeland. A war of presence, a war of nerves, a continuous silent assertion that the borders of the Soviet Union were no longer sanctuaries but front lines. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, the Voiska PVO, were looking down. They were fixated on the heat and dust of Afghanistan. They never looked up, never imagined the giants circling just beyond their reach. The stage for this high-altitude drama was set by the collision of 2 collapsing empires and the immutable logic of the Cold War. By the late 1970s, the geopolitical certainty of bipolar stalemate was fracturing. In Washington, a sense of American malaise and strategic retreat, punctuated by the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the Soviet adventures in Africa, created a pervasive anxiety. In Moscow, an aging Brezhnev Politburo, emboldened by perceived American weakness and a relentless military buildup, saw an opportunity to cement a strategic victory on its southern flank. Afghanistan was the tinderbox. The Sour Revolution of April 1978 brought the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, to power in Kabul, but its radical reforms and brutal purges ignited a nationwide insurgency. By 1979, the Afghan army was disintegrating, and the PDPA regime, led by Hafizullah Amin, was on the brink of collapse. For the Kremlin, this presented an existential threat, the potential loss of a communist ally, and the spectre of an Islamist, potentially US-aligned state directly bordering the Soviet republics of Central Asia. After months of agonized debate, the Soviet leadership made a fateful decision. On December 24, 1979, the first flights of the 105th Guards Airborne Division began landing at Kabul airport. The Soviet-Afghan War had begun. The international reaction was swift and severe. He enacted a series of punishing measures: a grain embargo, a boycott of the Moscow Olympics, and, most significantly, the withdrawal of the SALT II treaty from Senate consideration. But Carter's response was largely diplomatic and economic. The military dimension of the American counterstroke would be defined by his successor. The election of Ronald Reagan in November 1980 represented a fundamental shift in Cold War posture. Reagan and his advisors viewed détente as a failed, one-sided concession to Soviet expansionism. They believed in peace through strength, a concept that would be manifested in the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. The Reagan Doctrine explicitly committed the United States to rolling back Soviet gains by supporting anti-communist insurgencies worldwide. Afghanistan became the centerpiece of this policy. Covert aid to the Mujahideen, which had begun tentatively under Carter, was massively accelerated and formalized. Billions of dollars in weaponry, funneled through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, began flowing into the Afghan mountains. But the American strategy was never solely about Afghanistan. It was a multi-front pressure campaign designed to strain the Soviet system to its breaking point, while the CIA supplied Kalashnikovs and later Stinger missiles to harass the Soviet 40th Army on the ground. The United States Strategic Air Command, SAC, was tasked with applying pressure from the skies, a pressure so constant and vast it would become a permanent feature of the geopolitical atmosphere. This was the dawn of the concept of the Second Front in the Cold War. As Soviet Mi-24 helicopter gunships dueled with Mujahideen ambushes in the Panjshir Valley, another confrontation was being calibrated at the highest levels of strategic command. The Soviet Union had long enjoyed the psychological comfort of a defensive perimeter, a vast territorial sanctuary protected by the world's most dense and layered air defense network. The war in Afghanistan was a bleeding ulcer on the periphery. What SAC intended to do was to hold a knife to the aorta 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and make the Kremlin feel its presence with every laboured breath. The B-52 Stratofortress, a veteran of Vietnam, was the chosen instrument, but it was no longer just a bomber. It was being transformed into a mobile, persistent launch platform for a new generation of standoff weapons. Its mission was no longer to penetrate at high altitude, but to lurk just outside the kill zone, a constant, undeniable threat that would force the Vojska PVO to look outward, to stretch its resources, to live in a state of perpetual alert. The border between routine patrol and acts of war became deliberately, dangerously blurred. To understand the profound psychological impact of the B-52 patrols, one must first understand the two opposing systems, the Spear and the Shield. The United States Strategic Air Command was an institution built for the apocalypse. Its motto, "Peace is our profession," masked a relentless daily rehearsal for global thermonuclear war. At the heart of its power was the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. First flown in 1952, it was a symbol of enduring strategic might. By the early 1980s, the fleet, particularly the updated B-52G and H models, had undergone a radical transformation. They were no longer just high-altitude gravity bomb carriers destined for suicidal penetrations of Soviet airspace. They were now the launch platforms for the AGM-86B air-launched cruise missile, ALCM. The ALCM was a revolution. A small, terrain-hugging, jet-powered drone with a nuclear warhead and a range exceeding 1,500 miles, it could be launched from outside the range of most Soviet border defenses. A single B-52 could carry up to 20 of these weapons. Its mission profile shifted accordingly. Instead of the high-speed, low-level cell penetrations of the past, the B-52s adopted a loitering posture. They would fly pre-planned routes, known as positive control tracks, along the periphery of the Soviet Union, over the Arctic Ocean, the North Pacific, the Norwegian Sea, the Mediterranean. From these orbit points, their ALCMs could reach any target in the Western USSR. The bomber itself might as well have been invisible. Its weapons were the threat, and they could be launched from international airspace. This was the concept of standoff attack, and it rendered a significant portion of Soviet interior defense infrastructure obsolescent before it was even fully built. Facing this evolving threat was the Soviet Air Defense Forces, the Vojska PVO. This was a separate military service, a vast empire of radar stations, interceptor aircraft and surface-to-air missile SSAM batteries. Its mission was sacrosanct, to create an impenetrable shield over the motherland. The PVO's philosophy was one of centralized, rigid control. Its crown jewel was a vast, interconnected network of early warning radars like the henhouse and doghouse systems, designed to detect incoming ICBMs and bombers at extreme range. For aircraft, there were chains of ground-controlled intercept GCI radars that would guide regiments of specialized fighters, the Sukhoi Su-15 Flagon, the Mikoyan MiG-25 Foxbat, and later the MiG-31 Foxhound, to destroy intruders. But this mighty shield had critical blind spots and a fatal rigidity. Its focus was overwhelmingly on the traditional threat axes, the North American Arctic and Europe. Its radars looked outward for massive bomber streams or high-flying spy planes. The system was less optimized for tracking a single, aging bomber flying a routine-looking track hundreds of miles offshore, especially one that was now a missile truck rather than a penetrator. Furthermore, the PVO was plagued by a culture of fear and cover-up. Reporting a false alarm or failing to detect a real incursion could end an officer's career. This often led to a tendency to filter out ambiguous contacts to explain them away as weather phenomena, flocks of birds, or civilian air traffic. The system was designed for a war of unambiguous blips and declared hostilities, not for a grey zone of perpetual ambiguous provocation. This was the precise gap that SESI's operations exploited. They were not secret. In fact, their power derived from the Soviet knowledge that they were there. Every Soviet intelligence collection vessel, every fishing trawler bristling with antennas, every radar site on the Kola Peninsula or Kamchatka would detect these flights. The B-52s would sometimes even turn their own targeting radars on for short looks, painting Soviet coastal defenses, a blatant electronic fingering of the shield to test its reaction. The message was unambiguous. Your border is not secure. Your sanctuary is under our guns every minute of every day. And all the while, the Soviet high command was consumed by the gritty, brutal reality of Afghanistan. The PVO's resources and attention were split. Budgets, personnel, and leadership focus were pulled toward the southern theatre, where a different kind of air war was being fought, one of helicopter assault lifts and close air support against an elusive guerrilla foe. The strategic shield was being stressed from the outside, even as the state it protected bled from a wound within. The stage was now set. The players were in motion. In the skies above the icy frontiers, the invisible giants began their endless patrol, a constant, rumbling counterpoint to the crack of AK-47 fire in the Hindu Kush. The B-52 patrols were never solely about Afghanistan. They were a masterclass in strategic signaling, a continuous physical manifestation of the Reagan administration's harder-line doctrine. This was the concept of escalation dominance, applied to the psychological plane. The United States sought to demonstrate not just the capability, but the unwavering will to initiate and prevail at every rung of the conflict ladder, up to and including nuclear exchange. Operation Global Shield and its associated exercises like Global Thunder were the vehicles. These were not short-term drills, but sustained global operations that pushed bomber alert rates to heights not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. A typical cycle would see B-52s from bases like Minot in North Dakota and Griffiths in New York deploy forward to alert pads at bases in Guam, Alaska, Maine, and the United Kingdom. From these forward positions, they would launch on simulated wartime missions. They would fly for 24, 36, sometimes 48 hours at a time, refueling multiple times from KC-135 and KC-10 tankers, their crews living on box lunches and catnaps. The flight paths were meticulously calculated to simulate real attack profiles. A bomber out of Alaska would arc north over the Aleutians, then turn west to fly a racetrack pattern just outside Soviet airspace in the North Pacific. Its ALCMs theoretically targeted at Vladivostok, Petropavlovsk, and the Siberian industrial heartland. Another from bases in the UK would probe north into the Norwegian Sea, threatening the Kola Peninsula, home to the Soviet Northern Fleet and its ballistic missile submarines. The Mediterranean-based aircraft would loom over the soft southern underbelly of the USSR. The psychological calculus was precise. S normalized the presence of nuclear-armed bombers on the Soviet Union's doorstep. It forced the Voiska PVO into a state of perpetual, exhausting readiness. Every blip on a radar screen had to be analyzed, tracked, and assessed. Interceptor pilots sat in cockpits on strip alert, scrambling repeatedly to identify these giants, only to watch them turn away at the last moment. A ritual of brinkmanship played out in sub-zero temperatures at 40,000 feet. The cost to the Soviets was measured in wasted fuel, eroded morale, and the slow, grinding depreciation of complex machinery and human vigilance. The goal was to inculcate a sense of inevitable encirclement and technological inferiority, to make the Soviet leadership feel besieged in their own fortress. The success of this prolonged provocation hinged on a critical and deliberate technological asymmetry. The B-52 of the 1980s was a vastly different machine from its Vietnam-era predecessor. Its survival no longer depended solely on altitude or speed, but on electronic stealth and standoff range. Central to this was the AN/ALQ-117, later the AN/ALQ-172, a comprehensive electronic countermeasures ECM suite. This system was a technological orchestra. It could detect Soviet radar emissions, identify their type and location, and then jam them with precisely tuned counter-frequencies. It could inject ghost signals onto enemy scopes, creating false targets and overwhelming tracking systems. The ALCM itself was a nightmare for air defenses. Flying at nap-of-the-earth altitudes, guided by a revolutionary terrain contour matching TERCOM system that compared radar altimeter readings to pre-programmed digital maps, it was designed to slip beneath radar coverage. To a Soviet radar operator, a B-52 launch of 20 ALCMs would mean not one target, but 21, the large, relatively slow bomber, and a swarm of small, low-flying, nearly invisible cruise missiles, each on a different path. Conversely, the Soviet PVO's technological response was hampered by its own structure and the nature of the threat. Their premier long-range surveillance radars, like the P-14 Tall King, were designed to detect large, high-flying objects at great distance. A B-52 flying a lazy orbit 200 miles offshore, just beyond territorial waters, might appear as a faint, ambiguous return, easily dismissed as clutter or a civilian airliner on a polar route. The Soviet coastal and border radar network had gaps, particularly over vast, unpopulated Arctic and Pacific expanses. Furthermore, the Soviet interceptor force was built for destruction, not persistent shadowing. A MiG-31 Foxhound, armed with long-range R-33 missiles, was a formidable killer, but it had limited loiter time. Scrambling to meet a B-52 patrol required a massive logistical effort: tankers, ground control, multiple interceptors, for a target that would simply turn away, forcing the Soviets to break off or risk an international incident. The B-52 held the initiative. It could probe, retreat, and probe again, testing reaction times and defense footprints, all while its ALCMs sat inert but armed, their virtual flight paths etched into the targeting computers. A silent, digital siege laid against the map of the Soviet Union. The battlefield was the electromagnetic spectrum, and the B-52, this 1950s airframe, had been transformed into a sophisticated electronic warfare platform. Its greatest weapon was not the nuclear warhead in its belly, but the profound uncertainty it sowed in the minds of the men tasked with guarding the sky. Beyond the grand strategy and cold machinery, this was a war fought by exhausted men in dimly lit rooms and vibrating metal cockpits. For the crews of the Strategic Air Command, the missions were a grind of epic monotony, punctuated by moments of acute tension. A typical global shield sortie could last over 30 hours. Crews of 6, pilot, co-pilot, radar navigator, electronic warfare officer, EWO, and gunner, endured the physical toll of high altitude, constant engine noise, and circadian rhythm disruption. They subsisted on boxed crew meals heated on a small oven and slept in shifts on cramped rest bunks. Their world was the cockpit, a panorama of instruments glowing in the night, the thrum of the engines, a constant reminder of their lethal payload. The electronic warfare officer was the key player in the psychological duel. His station, facing a wall of scopes and analyzers, was the nerve center for the aircraft's electronic cloak. His job was to listen. As the B-52 approached its orbit point, he would monitor the beeps and squeaks of the Soviet air defense network coming to life. He'd identify the specific radars painting them, acquisition, tracking, missile guidance, and select the appropriate jamming programs from the ALQ-172's library. A successful mission was one where the Soviet radar picture was degraded, confused, or forced to resort to less effective backup frequencies. The EWO's headset was a window into the Soviet mind. The intensity and type of emissions told a story of alert levels, confusion, or practiced routine. He was both hunter and hunted, his success measured in the silence or the frustrated chatter on the other side of the electronic wall. On that other side, in the concrete bunkers of the PVO, the pressure was of a different kind. Radar operators, often young conscripts, stared at phosphor screens for shifts that blurred into one another, tasked with distinguishing the critical signal from the oceanic noise of natural interference. The culture of the Soviet military, where admitting a problem could be career-ending, incentivized explaining away contacts. A senior officer might dismiss a faint, intermittent blip as anomalous propagation, or a weather balloon, rather than log a potential bomber incursion that could trigger a high-alert cascade all the way to Moscow. This created a dangerous filter. The very system designed for ultimate vigilance was, at the human level, often programmed to see nothing. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies like the KGB's 16th Directorate and the GRU collected the electronic fingerprints of every B-52 patrol, building an order of battle and trying to discern patterns. But the pattern was the patternlessness, the relentless 24/7 presence itself. It was a form of noise jamming on a strategic scale designed to overwhelm not just radars, but institutional cognitive capacity. The aerial ballet on the borders was a direct reflection of the men in the Kremlin and the White House. For Ronald Reagan and his key advisors, particularly Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger and CIA Director William Casey, the B-52 patrols were a crucial piece of a coherent, aggressive strategy. They were not reckless gambits, but calibrated pressures. Reagan's worldview was fundamentally different from his predecessors. He believed the Soviet Union was not a permanent, immutable fixture, but an evil empire that could be pushed to the brink of economic and ideological collapse. The military buildup, including the B-52 patrols, was designed to force the USSR into an unwinnable arms race, draining resources from an already stagnant economy. Every ruble spent scrambling MiG-31s to shadow a B-52 was a ruble not spent on consumer goods, industrial modernization, or the war in Afghanistan. It was economic warfare waged with jet fuel and radar waves. In Moscow, the situation was one of deepening paranoia and decay. By 1982, the gerontocratic leadership was passing from Brezhnev to Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief. Andropov possessed a keener, more pessimistic understanding of the Soviet Union's vulnerabilities. The intelligence flowing to his desk painted a terrifying picture: a relentless American military buildup, new strategic weapons like the Pershing II missiles in Europe, capable of striking Moscow in minutes, and now these constant bomber patrols that seemed to be probing for weakness in the Soviet shield. Andropov and the Soviet High Command genuinely believed in the possibility of an American first strike. NATO exercises like Able Archer 83, which simulated a nuclear release sequence, were interpreted by some in the KGB as potential cover for a real attack. From this perspective, the B-52s were not just symbols, they were the leading edge of the spear. Their constant presence normalized the threat of sudden attack. It shortened the Soviet decision-making window from days to hours. In the minds of the aging Politburo, the war in Afghanistan was a distant, painful counterinsurgency. The B-52s on their borders represented an existential threat to the homeland. This perception fundamentally skewed Soviet strategic priorities. Resources and high-level attention were diverted to the air defense of the motherland, even as the 40th Army in Afghanistan pleaded for more helicopters, better equipment, and a coherent political strategy. The leadership in Moscow was fighting the war they feared, a nuclear confrontation with America, while their soldiers died in the war they actually had. The invisible giants, therefore, achieved a profound strategic diversion, locking the Soviet gaze onto the horizon while the foundation of their empire crumbled from within. The stage was now primed for a moment of supreme crisis, a point where this shadow game of provocation and paranoia would nearly ignite the very war it was meant to deter. November 1983. The autumn of 1983 represents the most dangerous moment of the late Cold War. A period where simulated postures and psychological operations bled into the red-lit reality of a potential nuclear exchange. The constant pressure of the B-52 patrols had stretched the nerves of the Soviet High Command to a breaking point. Two events that November would fuse together in the Soviet consciousness, transforming perceived American provocation into a tangible belief in imminent attack. The first was Operation Able Archer 83. This was a massive 10-day NATO command post exercise commencing on November the 2nd. It was designed to simulate the transition from conventional warfare to a coordinated nuclear release procedure. President Reagan and UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher practicing coded communications and decision-making chains. For the first time in such an exercise, NATO used new, secure communication protocols and practiced a distinctive, realistic pattern of message traffic that mirrored what would be used in an actual countdown to war. From the Soviet perspective, watching through the lenses of KGB residencies in Western Europe and signals intelligence, SIG-INT stations, the line between drill and reality vanished. The movement of key personnel, the encryption patterns, the very structure of the exercise, it all fit their intelligence models for a pre-attack preparation phase. Simultaneously, the routine B-52 patrols took on a new, sinister character in this heated context. Flights that were part of the continuous bomber presence were now interpreted not as standalone shows of force, but as the strategic opening move of the attack simulated by Able Archer. In the Soviet war room, the dots connected with terrifying logic. The exercise was the command and control rehearsal, and the bombers on the periphery were the first echelon of the physical strike force, positioning themselves for launch. Navy and Air Force operation, Operation Ryan. This was the Soviet codename for their own massive intelligence collection effort ordered by Andropov to detect signs of a NATO nuclear first strike. S-intelligence noted an alarming shift in Soviet behavior. Reconnaissance flights by Soviet Bear bombers became more aggressive, probing deeper into NATO air defense zones. Soviet nuclear submarines vanished from their usual anchorages. Eastern Bloc intelligence officers across Europe were placed on highest alert, reporting on everything from the parking patterns at NATO bases to the blood supply levels at Western hospitals, a crude metric for anticipated casualties. Most critically, the Soviet air defense forces went to an unprecedented state of readiness. Fighters in East Germany and Poland were armed with live nuclear air-to-air missiles. Missile battalions were forward deployed, and the response to the ever-present B-52s changed. No longer were they merely tracked and occasionally intercepted. Now, Soviet interceptor regiments were placed on strip alert with orders that hinted at preemption. The cat-and-mouse game had turned deadly serious. A B-52 crew flying a global shield mission over the Norwegian Sea in early November 1983 would have seen a stark difference in the electronic environment. The Soviet radars would have been active in wartime modes, their signals more intense, less predictable. The interceptors that scrambled to meet them would have done so with a speed and aggression that communicated not routine shadowing, but a desperate attempt to establish a combat air patrol in what was believed to be the opening minutes of World War III. For a period of approximately 72 hours from November 8th to 11th, the Soviet leadership genuinely believed a NATO attack was imminent. In a secret bunker outside Moscow, the nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, was kept at ready. The world stood on a hair trigger, and the constant, rumbling presence of the B-52s, the very instrument of psychological pressure, had become the primary catalyst for a catastrophic misunderstanding. The invisible giants were no longer just symbols. In the eyes of the Kremlin, they had become the vanguard of annihilation. While Able Archer brought the superpowers to the global brink, a parallel turning point was unfolding in the skies over Afghanistan, a direct tactical consequence of the strategic pressure the B-52s represented. The Soviet 40th Army's greatest advantage was its dominance of the third dimension. The Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunship was the flying tank of the conflict, and fleets of Mi-8 HIP transports moved troops and supplies with impunity. The Mujahideen had no effective counter. Soviet aircraft operated from secure airbases like Bagram and Shindand, sanctuaries where the war felt distant. This mirrored, in miniature, the Soviet homeland's sense of inviolability that the B-52 patrols sought to erode. The American decision to supply the Mujahideen with the FIM-92 Stinger missile in the fall of 1986 was the Afghan theatre's equivalent of the ALCM. It was a precision standoff weapon that transformed the battlefield from the ground up. S strategy of relentless pressure. While CCC stretched the PVO thin on the periphery, the CIA delivered a weapon that shattered the Soviet sense of sanctuary in their own occupied territory. The first confirmed Stinger kill occurred on September 25, 1986, when Mujahideen near Jalalabad downed a Mi-24. The effect was instantaneous and psychological. The missile's fire-and-forget guidance, its devastating hit probability, and the distinctive lock-on tone from its seeker head became a new soundtrack to the war. Soviet pilots, who had grown accustomed to flying low and slow to pinpoint guerrilla positions, were now forced to operate above 10,000 feet, drastically reducing their accuracy and situational awareness. Helicopter assault tactics had to be completely rethought. The loss rates were staggering. In the first year of the Stinger's deployment, over 200 Soviet aircraft were confirmed destroyed. This tactical revolution in Afghanistan completed the strategic pincer movement initiated by the B-52 patrols. The message was now universal and inescapable. For the Soviet soldier in the Hindu Kush, there was no safe airspace. For the Politburo in Moscow, there was no secure border. The war had come home on two fronts. The invincible shield of the PVO was revealed as porous against high-technology standoff weapons, whether they were ALCMs launched from international airspace or shoulder-fired missiles rising from a rocky outcrop in Paktia province. The psychological impact on the Soviet military psyche was profound and corrosive. The confidence that had underpinned the initial invasion evaporated. A grim joke began circulating among Soviet troops. The soldier who doesn't dream of a trip home in a black tulip, the Antonov transport plane that carried coffins, has no heart. The sense of inevitable grinding attrition, coupled with the humiliation of being technologically outmatched by a guerrilla force, became a mirror of the larger national anxiety fostered by the American strategic posture. The B-52s had created a climate of siege. The Stingers proved the walls could be breached. By late 1987, the convergence of these pressures, the endless financial drain, the global strategic encirclement, the domestic disillusionment symbolized by the Cherny-Tulpan flights, and the bloody stalemate turned active defeat in the Afghan skies, created an untenable reality for the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. The war was not just unwinnable on the ground, it was destabilizing at the strategic level. The continuous bomber presence had helped create a world where the Soviet Union could not feel secure, could not project power, and could not afford the empire it had built. The decision to withdraw became not merely a tactical retreat from Afghanistan, but a necessary step to de-escalate the total confrontation that the invisible patrols had come to symbolize. The turning point was not a single battle, but the cumulative weight of a strategy that made the Soviets feel perpetually and vulnerably under the gun. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet armoured column, commanded by Lieutenant General Boris Gromov, crossed the Friendship Bridge from Afghanistan back into the Soviet Union at Termez. The withdrawal was a meticulously staged piece of political theatre, but it could not mask the defeat. The 40th Army left behind over 15,000 dead, tens of thousands wounded, and a client regime in Kabul that would outlive the USSR itself by only 3 years. The war had lasted 9 years, 1 month, and 19 days. Its end was the first major crack in the edifice of Soviet power. For the United States, the withdrawal was heralded as a vindication of the Reagan Doctrine and the strategy of multi-front pressure. Covert aid to the Mujahideen had achieved its primary geopolitical objective, making the Soviet adventure in Afghanistan unbearably costly. But the aftermath of the shadow war waged by the B-52s was more subtle, revealed in the secret assessments and post-mortems conducted by both sides in the early 1990s. Intelligence officials gained access to their Soviet counterparts. What they learned was a sobering shock. The Able Archer 83 crisis had been far more serious than anyone in the West had realized. Through channels like the CIA's Soviet East European Division, and later from defectors and archival material, it became clear that the Soviet leadership had genuinely believed a NATO nuclear attack was underway. The constant strategic bomber patrols had been a key factor in conditioning that belief. A formerly top-secret CIA assessment from 1990 concluded, the exercises and the patrols designed to demonstrate strength and resolve had been perceived in Moscow as the final preparation for a decapitating first strike. Strategic circles. The doctrine of aggressive provocation and psychological pressure, while successful in some metrics, had carried an unacceptable risk of catastrophic miscalculation. It led directly to the establishment of more robust military-to-military communication channels, like the Nuclear Risk Reduction Centers, and a new emphasis on transparency and strategic exercises in the post-Cold War era. The men who had flown the B-52 patrols listened to these revelations with a quiet, retrospective chill. Their routine missions, their tracks in the sky, had been threads in a tapestry the other side saw as a hanging noose. In Moscow, the aftermath was one of bitter reckoning and accelerating collapse. The war in Afghanistan was an open wound, but the constant strategic pressure from programs like Global Shield had been a systemic, hidden hemorrhage. Strategic threat. Rubles that could have modernized a stagnating civilian economy were poured into next-generation air defense systems like the S-300, into vast fleets of interceptors, and into the black hole of strategic weapons research. The economic distortion was immense. The Soviet Union had spent itself into oblivion trying to match an adversary who was economically and technologically capable of sustaining the competition indefinitely. The Vojska PVO, the once proud Shield, entered a period of institutional crisis. The failure to decisively counter the B-52 ALCM threat, a failure born of technological lag and doctrinal rigidity, was a deep professional humiliation. Even more galling was the retrospective understanding of how completely they had been manipulated. The patrols had gathered priceless intelligence on Soviet radar frequencies, response times, and intercept procedures with every flight. The invisible giants had been all-seeing, collecting the electronic order of battle of the entire Western Soviet border. This intelligence vacuum would have been decisive in any conflict, and its existence was a testament to a profound asymmetry in the quality of the two sides' reconnaissance and electronic warfare capabilities. The Shield, it turned out, had been made of glass, and the Americans had spent a decade meticulously mapping every flaw. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not end the strategic dynamic pioneered during the Afghan War era. Instead, it fossilized the American advantage and set the pattern for 21st century power projection. The lessons learned from the continuous bomber presence became doctrinal bedrock, strategic command in the 2000s. Today, it is not B-52s alone, but the triad of the B-52H, the B-1B Lancer, and the B-2 Spirit that maintains this watch. The orbits have shifted from the Arctic periphery of the USSR to the coastlines of the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East, with Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar as modern-day equivalents of the forward operating locations of the 1980s. The mission's stated purpose remains identical: to assure allies, deter adversaries, and provide a rapid, flexible global strike option. The psychological playbook is unchanged. The persistent, visible presence of heavy bombers is a tangible reminder of reach and resolve, now aimed at capitals like Beijing, Pyongyang, and Tehran. Technologically, the legacy is embedded in the very DNA of modern aerial warfare. The standoff weapon, perfected with the ALCM, is now the default tool of power projection. The B-52s that still fly today are slated to carry the next-generation AGM-181 long-range standoff LRSO missile, a direct successor to the weapons that once held the Soviet Union at risk. The concept of the bomber as a long-duration, networked intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance (ISR) and weapons platform, first fully realized in the Global Shield missions, is now standard. The Electronic Warfare Officer's suite has evolved into a fusion of cyber and electronic attack capabilities, with modern systems like the AN/ALQ-172V3 capable of disrupting integrated air defense networks in a way its 1980s predecessor could only imagine. For Russia, the trauma of that era shaped its post-Soviet military philosophy. The perceived vulnerability to standoff attack and the humiliation of the PVO's inability to decisively counter it fueled a relentless, if uneven, drive to rebuild an A2AD, anti-access area denial bubble. Systems like the S-400 Triumph and the S-500 Prometei are designed explicitly to push the launch points of aircraft like the B-52 and their cruise missiles as far from Russian borders as possible. S and NATO reconnaissance aircraft near its borders remain routine, a reflexive muscle memory from a time when every unidentified blip carried the potential for nuclear war. The human cost on both sides left a quieter, more personal legacy. For the SAC veterans, the long, grinding patrols were a defining chapter of service, often overlooked in popular narratives of the Cold War. Many would only later comprehend the full strategic weight they had carried. In Russia, the generation of PVO officers and conscripts who stood those watches internalized a lasting sense of technological inferiority and encirclement, a worldview that continues to influence the national security psyche. The Afghan Mujahideen, armed with the tools of this proxy struggle, achieved their tactical victory, but were soon abandoned to a civil war that gave rise to new global threats, a stark lesson in the law of unintended consequences. Ultimately, the unseen war of the B-52 patrols proved a decisive experiment in non-kinetic coercion. It demonstrated that airpower could achieve strategic effects not just through destruction, but through the perpetual imposition of risk and the relentless consumption of an adversary's resources and attention. It bankrupted the Soviet sense of security, proving that in the modern age, there are no true sanctuaries, only degrees of vulnerability. The border between war and peace, as defined by those circling giants, was not a line on a map, but a permanent state of contested awareness, a lesson every major power has since learned and now practices in the silent, watchful skies of the 21st century. The story of the invisible giants is not ultimately a tale of a single aircraft or a single war. It is a case study in the architecture of deterrence itself, architecture built as much on perception as on concrete, on psychology as on physics. The Soviet-Afghan War was fought in two distinct theatres. On the ground, it was a brutal, visceral conflict of mountain ambushes and scorched earth reprisals. But in the stratosphere, it was a war of calculus and cognition. The B-52 patrols existed in a realm of pure signal. Their power was not in the bombs they carried, but in the ambiguity they projected, in the relentless strain they placed on the Soviet decision-making loop. They turned the vast, defensible geography of the USSR into a liability, its endless borders a sieve through which threat could perpetually seep. This duality reveals a fundamental truth about modern conflict. The most decisive battles are often those never joined. The collapse of the Soviet Empire began not with the fall of the Berlin Wall, but with the slow, systemic failure to keep up, militarily, economically, psychologically, with a form of pressure that was as constant as the atmosphere. The B-52, an aircraft conceived in the age of propeller-driven fighters, became the instrument of this pressure because it was a platform that could evolve, that could be adapted to carry the weapons and the electronic systems that defined a new era of standoff warfare. It outlived its original adversary because it proved that in the long game of strategic competition, adaptability is a more potent force than raw power. The legacy of those silent patrols hangs over every geopolitical standoff today. The principle they embodied, that persistent presence can be as potent as promised violence, is now a cornerstone of global power dynamics. It asks a perpetual, haunting question of every nation. What do you do with a threat that never arrives but never leaves? For the Soviet Union, the answer was exhaustion and eventual dissolution. For future adversaries, the calculus continues, played out now with stealth bombers, hypersonic missiles, and cyber probes, but always following the same unforgiving logic first written in the contrails of a B-52 over a frozen sea. In the end, the greatest weapon of the Cold War was not the missile in the silo, but the idea in the mind. The invisible giants made one idea inescapable. There was no sanctuary. And in that stark, silent realization, the balance of a world forever shifted.